Welcome back. This is the Big Blue Banter podcast. I'm Dan Schneider, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, the man who I catch grinding hours and hours of film in his free time when he doesn't have to worry about some jerk off crashing into his car and running away, and that's Nick Turchin. Nick, feel free to rant about that hit and run upstate New Yorker guy first if you want to, but if not, want to move past it. Today is all about the New York Giants secondary. If you're just catching up, we've been breaking down the roster position group by position group during the dead period before training camp. This week, we broke from the norm earlier on Tuesday and had special guest, Draft Network guest Jordan Reed, to give an outside perspective on the roster. Thought it was a really strong podcast. He had some really good takes and more optimism than you would expect about the Giants roster from somebody who's outside of the organization, outside of covering the team. I would definitely check that out. Lastly, before we dive deep into the defensive back on this roster, I did want to drop one shameless plug. Our podcast is growing, and that's because of you. And we're starting to see some of that, which we can't get into too in depth right now, but we're starting to see some of the fruits of our labor, and it's awesome. If you do enjoy our content and you want to help us grow even bigger, please do us a favor and download every episode that hits on iTunes. Even if you just listen to it without the download, just hit the download to help us. Subscribe to the show, rate us, and pass it along to any Giants fans you know who want to learn more about the team and more about the in-depth game of football. Without further ado, it's time to dive into these defensive backs. Nick, before we break it down on an individual level, I wanted to drop a little bit of a brief primer. And look, I know the word brief and Dan Schneider don't really go synonymously, but I do want to touch on the overall position and the roles within this defense. If you look at the overall philosophy of where this defense is moving under James Bettcher and under Dave Gettleman, with the fact that the Giants were in nickel defense on 2/3 of their defensive snaps in 2018 and some kind of sub package on a whopping 84% of their defensive snaps in 2018, it's easy to see how important the defensive back position really is for this team building and for the roster construction moving forward. And the Giants have made that clear with their draft and free agency decisions over the past two offseasons. We'll fully dive into that on the show. Now, I know. Trust me, it's popular to hate on the Giants right now. And I know the backlash anyone receives, including myself, after any kind of positive take on this franchise. But I don't care. I don't worry about that. All I do is call it like I see it. That's how I've always done this. And this is a unit I'm excited about, the defensive backs. I see a lot of competition. I see a lot of unknown. I see a lot of talent. With the exception of Janoris Jenkins and the two safeties, I think anything can really happen in training camp with regards to how the Giants are going to fill out these roles. But before we dive into each individual player, Nick, I want you to give a primer on the defensive backs and how they're used within the scheme, because they are used very differently. So I'm going to let you dive into that, and I'm going to interject at times where I feel like we might need to clarify things for the fans, because obviously the way you talk about football, Nick, even has my head spinning a lot of the time. And I learn a lot every podcast. I say that every time, and I'll say it again because it's the truth. So, Nick, let's go ahead and give me a primer on this defense and break down how we're going to kind of go about breaking down each individual defensive back within the primer of the defense.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to take the look that we kind of did with the defensive lines, and we're going to kind of give some broad groups where we think guys are going to kind of go into. So let's start with those groups. Starting to the wide side of the field. So the hashes, even in the NFL, they do matter. The wide side of the field. The first player on the outside, the cornerback, right? We're going to label him a field corner. Now, those that watched a little bit of college ball, high school ball, or may be familiar with more of these terms that aren't as kind of used at the NFL level, or at least on the media side of the NFL level. The next player to the inside of him, usually covering down on a slot receiver, is the nickelback. So the nickelback in Bettcher's defense and many, many defenses is always set to the wide side of the field. Usually the formation strength is to the wide side of the field. But on the highest number of plays, the nickelback is going to be to the field. For those thinking about last year, that was mostly Grant Haley. The free safety position is going to be, we're going to describe a two-high defense. The free safety position is the safety to the wide side of the field. That mostly was Curtis Riley last year. The boundary safety is the safety to the short side of the field. That was mostly Landon Collins last year. Finally, the boundary corner on the short side of the field, playing to the short side. Now, the Giants played sides, so the field and boundary were interchangeable most of the time, and then they mixed and kind of did random things within that, to be fair, and in some cases matched up. But basically, that's how we kind of think of them in a defensive in the defensive way. Now, before we get to the coverages, what we have to kind of understand is, because all defenses are built this way, what are the roles that these guys are going to have in the run fit? How you defend the run. You have to stop the run first, and all coaches build upon that. So the front that we think about, let's just think about a basic 5-man offensive line for simplicity's sake. It's going to be 11 personnel probably, because that's what everyone runs now. And so that means what we just described in the coverage is nickel to match up against that. So with these
and just back it up real quick, Nick, so just in case anyone needs to be caught up on it, 11 personnel on the offensive side of the ball means they're using 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 1 running back. Okay,
Correct. So let's just say that tight end is off the ball, as they often are. So there's 5 offensive linemen. If there's 5 offensive linemen, that means there's 6 gaps created that the defense has to account for in some way. The vast majority of the time at the NFL level, those gaps are accounted by one man per gap, a 1-gap scheme. So if you need 6 men, basically, how do you get those 6 men? Those 6 men are usually the front, usually some level of a 4-2 front, which we described on the defensive line podcast. So to bring it to the secondary.
Just to back this up real quick, Nick, and again, I'm just going to keep doing this because I know in the past people have talked about we go sometimes a little too fast and a little too in depth. So remember, for the Giants, a 4-2 front or a 4-man front is not the old school style of Giants football you're thinking about. This doesn't mean you're going to have Tuck and OC on the edge with Fred Robbins and whoever else at the defensive tackle positions and Barry Cofield, all those guys. What this means is 2 interior guys, a combination of Lawrence, E.J. Hill, Dalvin Tomlinson, and maybe a couple of those other guys, McIntosh, Olsen Pierre, whoever else fits in there. 2 of those guys on the interior, and then 2 edge guys. Those could be Lorenzo Carter. That could be Marcus Golden. That could be Kareem Martin. All of those guys. So that's the 4-man front. And then the two that Nick is referring to are the linebackers that you're going to see Ogletree on almost every snap, most likely, and then someone else playing that linebacker position next to him. Okay, go on, Nick.
Yeah, so that's huge to get. So outside of that, we're back now to the defensive backs. The key thing to think about is outside of that, the players in the run fit. On either side of the field, you're going to have alley responsibilities or force defender responsibilities. Basically, the first guys that can make a play on the ball, on a running play, that are not in the box. Coaches like to call them box overhangs. And if you really want to take and run away with stuff like this basically guys in the college game, like Don Brown and elsewhere, they consider the foundation of their defense almost how you deal with those overhangs and what you do with them to either blitz or to make the offense do different things. It depends on those overhangs. So the overhangs that we're referring to the wide side of the field would be the nickelback. To the short side of the field, it's in some ways, it's often the boundary safety. It can be the will in other ways, but let's just think of it simplicity's sake. It's the boundary safety. He's the first guy that can make the play on a run that goes to the outside or just a run in general and run support that's not in the fit. It's important to think about that because if you're not in the fit, you have to keep leverage in what you're doing as you read the play, but it's not the same as go fill this gap. If it's power, you got to go move to another gap. It's less restrictive, I would say.
So, Nick, let me just interject here to make sure I'm following as well. You have your 6 box, as we talked about, the 2 interior linemen, the 2 edge, and the 2 backers. Now, you have these overhangs, essentially. You have the safety overhang, and then you have the nickel cornerback or the nickel back, whatever you want to call him. These 2 guys are not technically in the box to fill an 8-man box in a sense, because I know some people might be thinking it like that. In a sense, they actually have more responsibility in almost any other position on any given play. Is that correct?
That's one way to think of it because they're going to be the first point of contact that's not going to directly have gap responsibility in the run, but they're almost always going to have some sort of almost always passing responsibility in coverage. So
and just before we move on, Nick, just so we can be clear here, guys, because we're going to reference this again. These are going to be 2 positions that eventually we're going to talk when we talk about the players. We're going to say he fits into the overhang safety bucket, or he fits into the nickel bucket. So just keep these positions in mind when we reference them later. Okay, go on, Nick.
Gotcha. So I had a couple cool conversations with coaches recently at the high school and college and even a little bit at the NFL level. And basically there's 3 types of nickels in the league right now. And we're talking about the nickels to the wide side of the field, and we're going to talk about the weak side overhang as well. But let's start with the wide side. The wide side, there's 3 different types. You either have a coverage guy who's really more of a pure corner. He's almost He's basically his ability to mirror and match in space is very, very good. Then you have the second type would be a box linebacker. So this is more of like a linebacker who's really run first. That's how his mind is. That's why the way he's been programmed and how his style of play likes to get downhill. But he feels comfortable in space. And it's one of those players where like they're almost freakish athletes that they're 200 and X pounds, but in space they can do a lot of good. They can cover ground. They're twitchy, and in short area space and short area zones, they're very, very good. The third type would be like really a safety type who's not a liability in the run, but he feels very comfortable rolling him back in coverage versus whatever the defense is going to show to him, but he can just hold up against the run just enough where it's like, you kind of don't feel like he's a weakness. Those right. Three types of players play basically in that type of position. I think from a value perspective, thinking about team building from this now, I think that the Giants value guys highly that can fit maybe 2 of those buckets or maybe 1.5 of those buckets, where they're not just a pure coverage guy. They're not just a box backer who's run first only, but he's fast in space. They're guys that can do different things as they're asked to. What's important, what they're asked to do within the coverage scheme. So these overhangs, we're talking about the nickel and now the boundary safety. I would say the boundary safety, it's actually really the similar type profiles. It just tends to be a player who's more comfortable in short area space because there's less space over there. And versus the nickelback who has to cover more ground because you're playing to the wide side of the field. So awesome. with that in mind, the only other player, the one last thing that we're going to mention, because everyone always wants to get to this, what's the money backer? The money backer, to simplify, is really a player in the box, part of that 6-man front that's big enough to have a run responsibility on every down, but can cover a tight end or someone vertically down the field very comfortably away from the line of scrimmage from a shallow position. And is one of those things, it's like almost like a misfit. Like they used to call him betweeners. It's a guy that's not really a linebacker. He's not really a safety. And he's really not just a pure coverage guy in the traditional sense, the traditional, hey, you're going to do this 100% of the time. And so that position can be occupied in the Giant scheme by either player, the Mike or the Will. Most oftentimes on third down, it's going to be the guy closest to the tight end because that tight end's going to be on coverage. And now I think that's the basic part. Okay, so the only thing we wanted to get to is Nick, why are you describing it in these buckets, understanding that some of these buckets really sound the same like other buckets? It seems like the buckets kind of overlap, and that's exactly right. They overlap in traits. And the only example that I want to use is a play that I highlighted on Twitter. I asked Coaching Twitter what this coverage was called yesterday, and I got basically 15 DMs and like a lot of activity that took up most of my day in terms of guys commenting and pointing out what it is and where they see it. It's coverage that Betcher ran, and he ran a fair amount last year, but most kind of what I would say famously, or what I remember the most, is against Indianapolis at the end of the first half. And this is a coverage where this is a 2-high coverage. So basically we just described the field safety and a boundary safety. And within this 2-high coverage, it actually rotates into a cover 3 via a very odd way where both safeties buzz up forward to the second tier. The money backer runs all the way back to the middle of the field as the lone deep safety, and the corners basically play different techniques than they usually do. It looks kind of like chaos at the line of at the snap as the 2-high look completely morphs and changes to a 1-high look. Wow. The reason why I'm saying all this is Betcher doesn't do this just to do this. The next play on 2nd down and 10, he literally calls the same coverage, but it's as if those box overhangs all rotate one step like musical chairs, and then they all play the same roles that they played. They all play the next person's role up in line. So the rotation back comes from the nickelback. Grant Haley runs way back to the middle of the field, and he's the middle field close safety, the deep safety. The money backer is in a blitz position on the line of scrimmage in the B gap, and he retreats. Sean Chandler retreats to the middle hook, basically to the middle second tier defender. The safeties move up, but everyone had changed positions. And the reason why I use this example is not to show how crazy Betcher is, but that this encapsulates his mindset that he wants players that in one drive with the same personnel can basically play the next man's position in the defensive backfield. It makes it so that, and what did it do on this play? Andrew Luck paused he saw the coverage and literally stopped at the top of his drop as he was hitching and didn't deliver the ball, giving enough time for the simulated pressure to get there in a hurry, and it was an incomplete pass. Now, most people would say, well, where does that show up in the stat book? It's maybe a hurry, and that's not a sack, and I get it. But these types of schemes are what the better colleges and what Bettcher has been doing for the last half of last year, and I think we're going to see more of it this year. And what he really told you with this draft is you're seeing guys that can handle this from a mental perspective. And with that, we think we should go to the players.
Yeah, and before we dive into the players, Nick, I think it's really important to say, based on everything they said, well, first of all, I mean, you won't find a comment passing about when we talk about the sacks versus pressures debate where I have to say, for the last time, anyone who comes at me and talks about sacks and being the and be all end all pass defense and pass, and successful pass rush, I'm gonna just shove you to the side, because this is just a perfect example of how coaching can get in simulated pressure and can throw off a quarterback like Andrew Luck, who's obviously one of the best at processing in the NFL, to the point where, he's throwing an incomplete pass, they're punting, and they're getting off the field. And I think based on what Nick broke down to me before this and what he just tried to break down here, and hopefully we were clear in our breakdown, it goes to show you just how important this defensive back position is. It's a position that Bettcher is expecting players to play multiple roles in. It's a position that Bettcher is expecting them to play multiple roles in within the same defensive drive, and it's the only position. It's not the only position, but it's the position with the most responsibility, by far, without a doubt, within Bettcher's system. So, on that note, keep that in mind as we dive into the defensive back, and we're going to do this player by player, and we're going to start with the three constants that I believe are going to be on the field for close to 100% of the snaps, no matter what, and that's Janoris Jenkins, Antoine Bethea, and Jabril Peppers. So let's start this off, Nick, with Jenkins. By the Pro Football Focus metrics, and I do like how they break down the cornerback positions, because I know people debate other positions they break down and whatnot. He did take a major step back in 2018. Nick, based on what you saw, and more importantly, based on what you saw, do you agree with that? And more importantly, do you believe he can return to his 2016 and 2017 level with the Giants in 2019?
I think that the levels that you saw there was a comfort in a system that was calling the majority of calls in zone, and particularly cover 2 zone. I know that I wouldn't call Jenkins the prototypical cover 2 corner, which people think about someone who's physical and fast and plays really well in the flat and is kind of that old school Tampa 2 corner. I wouldn't really classify him there, but I think that he's a guy who likes to have zone eyes. So zone eyes, looking at the quarterback and being able to have a feel within the quarterback, and then moving when the quarterback moves based upon what he's seeing within the pattern distribution. You just don't get – you get that a fair amount with Bettcher, but you don't get it all the time. With Spags, you got it in the play calling mix. A very key thing that Dan and I talked about before this. The play calling mix under Spags was a lot of cover 2. Very deep safeties and corners that played with zone eyes. You don't see that as much now with Bettcher. So I think he had a strong conclusion to the season. I think he certainly showed he flashed physicality, which I thought was really cool. He showed that as a veteran, he showed the other players what it's like to play for a team that has little to play for.
Right.
But in terms of getting back to those levels, I'm just not sure I see that. And I think that when you see the new guys come in with Baker specifically, I think he can kind of help out in areas where Jenkins struggles.
Yeah, I mean that totally makes sense, Nick. It could be a case of, listen, he was a better fit for Spags' system, and that's what brought out his best talents. At the same time, I do think some credence should be given to the fact that Jenkins went through a lot last offseason. In addition to what went down with his brother, and for those who don't know, the house that Janoris Jenkins owned in New Jersey, his brother lived at during the offseason when Jenkins spent time in Florida, his home area, and there was a dead body found in that home. I don't want to dive too much deeper into this, but in addition to that, something else really bad happened with him from a family standpoint, to the point where during one of the training camp practices, Jenkins was excused and he left, and he came back about a few days later. And there was not much given by Shermer or anyone, obviously, and Jenkins himself, about what actually went down on that day. But something really serious happened with his family. And I remember he left practice kind of crying. I believe he was in tears. So I think a lot of that does play a bigger role than people think. These are still human beings. And if they're going through bad stuff off the field, it's going to impact their play. And as Nick said, he did play better down the stretch, and he played hard because he proved he wants to be a part of this roster. And the Giants rewarded him by keeping him on the roster. Now, his future, we don't know about. The Giants had a lot of defensive backs, and he has a massive cap hit during the 2020 season upcoming after this one. And a lot of it can be saved by cutting him. We'll deal with that later. But I do believe that Jenkins has a decent chance to kind of, even if he's not a perfect fit for this system, play better than he did throughout the entire season. But we're going to move on, Nick, and we're going to touch on Jabril Peppers. We talked a lot about him on the podcast when he was acquired, so we're not going to too much specifics here, Nick. But I want to know if you see any chance of him kind of sliding into the money back role or a different role that you saw from Landon Collins, or is there something, or is there kind of a further? Can you further break down the role we anticipate for Peppers going into his third season after kind of playing a weird hybrid role at Michigan, and then obviously now 2 seasons in the NFL with the Browns?
Yeah, playing that Viper role in Michigan, where Don Brown basically had to kind of convince him to be a second-tier player by renaming the position, or at least that's how he tells it in clinic season, which is always fun to hear. I think that specifically for the money backer, I think a lot of guys are going to have a chance at that slot in third and long situations. I do think, though, that when you break it down by trait for a second, and we're gonna toss him in the buckets. So the traits are that his range is a lot better than people realize, and his ability to play in space, particularly lateral speed at depth. I think he could even play in this as lone safety in the post a fair amount of times. I know that's not how a lot of other people see him, but there's a fair amount of shots with his range. I think it's more just kind of getting him used to playing that position. And because, again, kind of like Dan mentioned, he was the Viper in college, and he kind of jumps to the NFL, and he jumps to Greg Williams kind of play calling, and it's a little different. It's a little more cover 2 based, I would say, or deep safety based. But within that deep safety frame, I think that he's going to be able to cover just well enough. I think in man coverage, I think he was beaten by very good players last year, but that just happens. I think his man, so I'm higher on him man coverage wise. And so to put him in the buckets, I would throw him in interestingly, predominantly free safety, boundary safety bucket. I would also throw him in the nickel back to the field bucket on third down blitzing, because I think that he can handle that space with that range pretty easily. And I think in the run fit, I think at times in the run fit he can he can survive there because of basically being with Don Brown and having those drills and that fundamentals. But I don't think he's going to be there the majority of the time. I think his size. I think he's a guy that plays better away from the line of scrimmage than down. So I would put, and I think I talked about this when we broke him down, but he's a little bit more like the offspring of Matthew and Collins versus Collins. He's a lighter player that is lighter on his feet and is going to be able to kind of, and from a blitzing perspective too, do that. So I think you're going to see him blitz from even a little bit more of depth with Bettcher as well.
I love it. And listen, I got a lot of excitement about Peppers in Bettcher's scheme, but I want to temper it for now. I want to see it, but I do like the fact that, like you said, Nick, he fits well into multiple buckets on his defense, because I think that's what it's all about. But I want to talk about a player who may only fit into one bucket, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, but I like the bucket he fits into. And I'm talking about Antoine Bethea. And he's a player that I'm going to go to my grave this offseason, telling fans that was one of the best value signings and overall signings, in my opinion, of the entire offseason. Ageism, I think, is certainly at play from Giants fans and other NFL fans who seem to suffer from the recency bias of the free agent veteran signing Jonathan Stewart last offseason. Listen, Stewart and Bethea have nothing in common besides that they're older players and veterans. When I went back and I watched Bethea in 2018, he was one of the only Bettcher holdovers on that defense who made a pretty seamless transition into the new defensive scheme under Steve Wilks. Was he as good as he was in 2017 when he graded out as a top 10 safety in the NFL, the 9th best in 2017, his last season with Bettcher, according to PFF? Maybe not. But guess what? He's back in Bettcher's defense. So I love what he's going to bring to the defense in 2019. Nick, am I crazy here? Or what's going on with Bethea?
No, not crazy. He's someone who I really liked. And initially, if you remember the way he was signed pretty quickly, I believe, right? And
first signing of the offseason.
Correct. And look, we all understand there was a bit of a hole at free safety on the field and then in the wake of in the beginning of the offseason. So that had to be filled. And I think a lot of people want to think, just like Dan said, like it's kind of like almost like a little bit of cronyism. But at the end of the day, Bethea is very, very smart. his initial range and his play speed to break off the quarterback is I graded it as solid to good, which is pretty good for a player of that age to be able to keep up there. Basically, the faster a player processes things and the faster he gets his body in motion, the better the chance he has to do things and can make up for not having the athleticism or the long speed effectively to get to that play. I think Bethea is very strong there. So I'd throw him in the free safety bucket for sure. The FBI, the football intelligence is going to come in and play there. The ability to get guys lined up. We just talked about some complicated schemes. You got to have someone who can do that on a down-to-down basis, who has experience doing it. He has a lot doing that. The key thing that I think is kind of interesting is that no one really talks about. He's sneaky good in man coverage on tight ends. And I didn't know that until I watched. So I watched a lot of even his 18 tape, and his play strength, his ability to hold up against guys bigger than he is. He's not a guy that you look at and on third down and he's caught on a guy and it's like, oh God, that's a real liability. So that to me can put him in the boundary safety role as well. And one of those guys that can hover around the line of scrimmage pretty well. He did that a little bit more in 2016 with Betcher than he did in 2017. When I first watched the 17 tape, I was like, this guy's a pure free safety, pure range, yada, yada, yada. And of course, like the way anything else, you have to really, really dig. And he kind of comes from more of a line of scrimmage background. So I think you're going to have both a free safety and a boundary safety there, and a guy that, is going to have some sneaky pass deflections, pass breakups against tight ends.
No doubt. And as we move forward, Nick, because we kind of, as I said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do kind of see those three playing close to 100% of the snaps. Do you see it similar to that?
I think, you're coming out in the first 4 games, I think you got to say yes. It's just the way it goes. Yeah, I agree.
Look forward then on the roster, Nick, the way I see it, with Jenkins locked in, we've got 6 cornerbacks with a legitimate shot to fill out those final 2 cornerback spots when they're in nickel, or the final 2 defensive back spots, and the 3 spots when they're in certain sub packages. Obviously, some of the sub packages have safeties and not corners, which we'll get to. But let's start with the player I'm most excited about to kind of play another big role after they take on defense, and that's DeAndre Baker. Obviously, we broke him down in depth after the first night of the draft in our podcast there. You can go back and find it, and in a subsequent podcast. Jordan Reed touched on him yesterday. I touched on Tuesday when we had him on, and we got a little bit more into there. He closed out OTAs, seeing the majority of the first team reps, Nick, not all of them. But is there really any reason to believe he's not the favorite now for one of those? And you could tell me what cornerback spot this would be, but for the other opposite spot, let's call it.
I think that in college, and this is why we decided to break these, to give these field and boundary specifications down for corner, because they happen less in the NFL, but in college they absolutely played a factor. And he was a boundary corner at Georgia. He was a really, really, really good one. So yeah, his physicality and his ability to play, basically as in a lot of man against all different types of wide receivers is very, very strong. What you're going to see with him is you're going to see 2 things. Number one, and Jordan touched on this, his foot speed overall in off coverage, where he's 6 to 7 yards off line of scrimmage and he's facing a guy who's really, really fast. Can he carry that guy downfield as fast as other guys can? Maybe not. The other area that's going to be interesting and less people talk about is, he's really physical throughout the route, and you're able to do that in college. You're not able to do that in the NFL. There's absolutely going to be an adjustment period there. Barring those 2 variables, he's going to be starting, or he's, you're not going to see him coming off the field that much, I think, just because his overall competitiveness and his ability to mirror and match, and his ability to basically, he's just a fiery guy. He's a guy you want to have on the field. He's a guy when you watch him, you don't want to stop watching him. Your notes stop, but the tape doesn't, that type of thing. And so for me, I think that, he played mostly boundary in college, but he can certainly play in the NFL on either side. And you're going to have a thing where I don't think this Betcher defense is going to match up per se, unless if you're in defined man and you want a certain guy and certain thing, it's on a play-by-play basis. It's not going to be across the board. He's not that type of player. That player really doesn't really exist anymore as much. So I think that you're going to have a real solid starter to start, and someone who, fans may complain about, the draft capital it took to get him. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to really want this guy on the team.
And it's interesting, Nick, because as we kind of work through, we both kind of agree with those 4 kind of playing a majority of the snaps, but obviously they're in nickel a lot. So we need another defensive back to find to put, and by last year, and then they were in sub package on 84%. So it's almost every snap, guys. So I want to break it down like this, Nick, because I'm trying to figure out who's going to be that fifth guy, right? So most people view Jason Baker and then 28 supplemental draft Sam Beal as outside cornerback in that sense. But obviously, if the Giants feel like they're their best cornerback, they want to get on the field. Is there any way that you feel like any of these guys can fit into the bucket? To kind of move down to the nickel cornerback spot. You know what I'm saying? Do any of these guys fit another bucket?
Great question, and that's something I should have prefaced too. I think that on passing downs with Beal, if there's a physical wide receiver in 3rd and 9, I'm envisioning like a Julio Jones, who's just a freak, right? But he's got length and he's got speed. And if they're anticipating a route that's going to be shorter, they may want Sam Beal on him more because his length, his arms and his length, and his ability to hold up in that physicality in the short part of the game, that's his strength. If they've got a slot guy, I'm thinking of Mohamed Sanu, bigger player. You don't see many bigger guys in the slot. Can Beal bump down and play that one bucket of kind of that coverage, the man coverage guy there? I absolutely think he can, and he did a little bit in college. I think he can. So I would say it would be Beal kind of as the coverage wild card. I need to see more of him against the run. I know there's a willingness for physicality in college, but I think it's going to be a little different here. And just kind of want to kind of tighten that up and to really think if he could play that. So I see I think the big trait that he brings is the length and the ability to do that, and the ability to play physically. And so I think that when that's called on, I think he could be that guy.
Very interesting. But let's say, Nick, the Giants don't roll with those three. For the nickel position that we're talking about, Grant Haley closed out OTAs, taking the majority of the snaps, but I don't really think that means that much. I think these battles, honestly, are truly won in training camp. I've been to these practices, both OTAs at times and training camp last summer. There's nothing going on at OTAs, guys. It's not what you think it is, these practices. They're really just trying to install the plays. If we're being completely honest, there's no pads, there's no bump coverage. So I want to look forward to. I want to frame this as this job. This battle will be decided from this point on. So with that said, Nick, can Grant Haley hold off Julian Love and fit into that nickel bucket, or who? What do you foresee happening at that nickel spot?
I think the predominant snaps. Let's look at the profiles real quick. To go over Haley real quick, he's 5'9", he's 190 pounds. He ran a 4.45. Forget the 40 for a second. His arms are 29 3/4 long. Okay, his hand size is 9 1/8.
Right.
You have a smaller guy. Okay, you have a smaller guy who has a good ability to mirror match. He plays well in soft press, but he fits that coverage bucket against slot wide receivers. He's got pretty good intelligence, pretty good football intelligence, pretty good recognition, and he's actually a pretty good tackler for his size. But he has massive size limitations, and we've said this from like podcast day one for us. It's like this offseason is everything for him. He needs to gain play strength because he has the range to play that nickel back to the field, but not when there's a pulling, even just I want to say like an arcing tight end to his side. There are just so many examples where he ends up on the ground. And so his physical limitations, it's a real big roadblock for me comparing it to someone like a Julian Love. And again, the tape is the tape, but he's a guy who's 5'11", 195. He plays bigger than that. He's slower. Yeah. He's got a 4.45 40. He's slower, but his arm length is 31 3/4 inches long. His arm length is basically almost 3 inches longer. So that shows up because Haley plays long, but if you have those limitations, there's only so many things you can do. The ability to shed really comes from that, especially for these players against larger size guys. Now, Julian Love played predominantly boundary corner in college. A very good boundary corner at that. When he blitzed, though, which was super interesting, he played nickel back to the field. Now, there's a little bit of tell on the defense when they did that. It was like kind of 80% of the time, whatever the numbers are. When he was a nickel back to the field side, he would come sink down the line of scrimmage and blitz, and he blitzed pretty effectively. I see him, the transition for him is the ability to get comfortable in space, to get comfortable in the fit, and to get consistent with his tackling because he flashed. When the plays were run to him frequently in college, he tackled pretty well. I think overall playing – when the plays weren't run consistently to his side, I think he left a little bit to be desired at the college level. So that's what you're kind of looking for. But I think he's a guy who can potentially fit two buckets. So I look at it like this: you understand what Grant Haley's floor is, but you really understand what Grant Haley's ceiling is too. With Love, you don't really, his ceiling's undefined because I think he can fit the 2-bucket realm for you. Plus, he can play on the outside. I don't think Haley can play on the outside against even sized players in terms of capping vertical routes. And I hate to say it because you want to see these undrafted free agents win. You want to see them make the teams, and I think he can make a team. I think this team starts to get really, really crowded at that level because you've got these guys that their upside, their ceilings look higher.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting, Nick, because it brings me to something I wanted to touch on. I know we discussed this a bit off the podcast. You look at a guy like Haley, who obviously, graded out well according to Pro Football Focus, took over a big role last year, but with a lot of, I've actually, this is something even, you pointed out to me that I could have done a better job of. What I didn't really focus on or write any articles or content on was the fact that the Giants lost is a fine word. Both of the Giants' defensive backs coaches left the team. One went to Chicago, and that's Anaramo. And I forgot, where did the other one go, Nick?
I can't remember, but he's basically, instead of assistant defensive backs coach, Deshae Townsend is a full defensive backs coach.
Sure. So it's not, that part of it is not important where he went. The part that me and Nick discussed is that they didn't really get promotions. And even Pat Shurmur during his press conference kind of shrugged and said, I guess they left for promotions. Really, it was a lateral movement. Or the opposite of that. They have similar jobs to what they had. And Deshae Townsend is the one who brought over Curtis Riley with him. He was a handpicked safety who came with him. That's the reason he was there. But the point that me and Nick were trying to make here is that with new defensive back coaching, it's a clean slate, I believe, for all these guys. And I don't think that what Haley's done in the past is going to have much to say on what's going to happen in the future. Can he still win a job on this roster? Sure. But now he has to do it. There's a lot of guys, a lot more talent that fits into the bucket of position that he played last year where, there wasn't much talent that fit into that bucket last year. They weren't going to throw B.W. Webb there in that nickel spot. And they needed him on the outside. The guy played like 95% of the snaps, which is hideous. But the point I'm trying to make is that with a clean slate, both me and Nick are going to say one thing before we get to training camp, and that's keep an eye on Haley because neither of us are that confident that he's even going to make the roster, let alone hold on to that nickel position. Because, again, this harps on what we've been talking about, right, Nick? They want guys who fit into multiple buckets, right?
Right, absolutely. And just to jump into before, because I'm the one who talked about Anarumo before on offline. It's not Chicago. He went to before the fact checkers crush us. He went to Cincinnati, and that job was something that they couldn't fill for like 6 weeks. And it was a spot that was very, very tough. No one wanted to be the defensive coordinator there for kind of a lot of reasons. And they ended up hiring him, and so yeah, absolutely was a promotion. But it was one of those jobs where it was like he was like, oh my god, he took that job.
Right.
And so anyway, that's just for the fact checking. But yes, in terms of the buckets, I think that's what you got. That's what we're seeing because you're looking for those guys that can be painted with multiple brushes.
Yep, no doubt. So as we move forward, I do want to talk a little bit, Nick, about a guy who intrigues me, and that's Tony Lippett. I'm going to be honest with you. It's a crowded depth chart. It's going to be hard to crack. But you know what? I saw some awesome athleticism out of him at Michigan State. He's a former wide receiver, played D-back there as well. And then he had a lot of success at the NFL level at cornerback with Miami Dolphins before the injuries. Now, the injuries, who knows how people recover from injuries? We've seen players like Hakeem Nicks never recover from a lower body injury. It derailed his entire career. Similar situation with Victor Cruz. But if he's healthy again, it wouldn't shock me if Lippett is a surprise of training camp. Nick, do you have any thoughts on his game and kind of how he fits into these buckets?
I think what's hard is it's not just a limited tape thing. The tape that he had some gaffes. And some stuff where, one of the big plays I'm remembering, his play speed to get to where he needed to on the right angle was just not where it was. And so I think you got to see more reps within the system. And then, he's going to have the athleticism. But the one thing that that I wrote a couple times, and again, there's not many snaps, is, his intelligence to play speed, his intelligence to get to where he's going. And it's funny because you brought him up, and then I kind of thought of Tate Davis too, in really the same way, a guy who I like as an athlete, ex-safety, trying to play that linebacker position. And, there's just multiple times, even just from the tape today, I'm watching other guys, and it's like, wait, where's that? Who's covering? Oh, that's Tate Davis. He's not there yet. There's multiple examples like that. And it doesn't mean the guy can't do it. It's just that his play speed has to get to the point where he can play assignment sound in a defense that changes his assignments often.
Yeah, that's fair. It is still a long shot, guys. I'm not I'm well aware of that. But I want to move forward with the safeties a bit here, Nick. I'm going to let you kind of go freestyle at one point because we're going to want to look the other guys who can fit into these buckets. But I want to start with Sean Chandler. The Giants signed Chandler as an undrafted rookie free agent last year out of Temple, and he has a pretty awesome story. He grew up living homeless shelter to homeless shelter. He had to help provide for his family. Really tough kid. Worked his way onto the Temple rosters as a walk-on, eventually captain there. The coach there, globally, like a human being and as a player. Didn't play that much on defense until the end of the season. But you kind of see some upside here, and defense goes then into like what buckets you might fit into.
I think what's interesting with him is he's a guy. Chandler's a guy that didn't get a lot of snaps, but there's kind of an interesting when you watch his tape. You notice a few things. You can't just when you watch a player, you can never just watch his plays. You kind of have to watch the entire game to see the context of the game. That sounds obvious, but a lot of guys don't like to do that. One thing you see with Chandler, he was really playing in competition with Michael Thomas most of the time. Michael Thomas is a guy that's a veteran, can line guys up, can really help on the pre-snap phase of the game. That's what really blocked a lot of the Chandler snaps, especially after Collins went down. In the wake of Collins not being there, there's very few guys that can help line the defense up. So Sean Chandler's coming in at 5'10", 205 pounds. So already you see a little bit more bulk. It's funny, in terms of his body, it looks like he can add a little bit more mass in terms of, I think he can actually get a little bigger in terms of the way he holds his frame, even at 5'10". But I really liked the snaps that he played. I really like his play speed. I really like his change of direction and his movement skills while he's retreating from the line of scrimmage. And I think that you could look at a guy that could fit the bucket of boundary safety, money backer on passing downs, and even nickel back to the other side. And against kind of stockier or even tight end type matchups when he faced 12 personnel, and he would basically be the big dime safety. I think he needs further development. You're going to see more. You're going to want to see further development in just overall recognition and overall reps. Like, there's stuff that he hasn't seen yet because he was in kind of a limited role. But in the coverages that I described, with the one coverage I described earlier in the show, he has to retreat from the line of scrimmage. And a couple of guys picked me on Twitter like, wow, I feel really bad for that guy. It's really hard to do. And we had the conversation. It's like, hey, when you're asked to do that, then reset your eyes downfield. I thought of it like a quarterback turning his back to the defense and then having to reset once he comes to the top of his drop and play action. It's very, very similar. So you got to have a guy with good play speed, a guy who knows to identify, and he's in kind of a crucial position, kind of in the last line of defense there. So, the coach feels good enough about his range to ask him to run 20 yards to start the play. And then his play speed to basically get his eyes in the right position once he gets there. So for me, that was one of the bigger things. I liked his ability as a blitzer, something that he has to continually get better on. But he showed, of the guys outside of Collins and to some degree Curtis Riley, he was the third best blitzer. And that it's very hard for defensive backs to blitz. Grant Haley I'm sure can attest. Guys can attest. Michael Thomas can attest. It's not something that they do naturally. Playing through contact when the contact comes from a guy who's much bigger than they are, and then doing it efficiently to get to the quarterback as fast as humanly possible. So, like I said, I like Chandler. I like Chandler to make the team. I like Chandler to make the team as a backup role, filling those boundary safety, money backer buckets on passing downs and potentially nickelback.
Yeah, I mean, listen. You look at it, and obviously he needs development. You were clear about that. That's pretty obvious. But, hey, guy who fits into potentially 3 buckets, a guy who is not a bad blitzer, a guy who's awesome for them on special teams, it feels to me like I can lock him into my 53-man roster. I really do feel that way. They're not just looking for, they're looking for guys like that. That's the whole point of all this with the Giants defense. But let's move on to a player who might not come into as many buckets. You can tell me if I'm wrong, and that's Michael Thomas. What do the Giants have with Michael Thomas?
So Michael Thomas, they've got a veteran. They've got a guy who, kind of like we described, he fits that third bucket really, really well as a safety who's basically not a liability in the run fit. He's not amazing in the run fit, or close down to the box as an overhang, I should say. And he feels good. He feels good as a safety in coverage, and he's a veteran presence. What I find interesting about this is with Bethea on the team, is he going to get as many snaps, or is his role going to shift back to more of a pure special teams role?
Right.
And I don't think that's really a bad thing because this team prides itself on special teams. He's a special teams captain too, right? So,
Yep.
so you're. It's not like, oh, I don't think he's going to get cut. I'm just saying, like, is he going to be in the mix in these buckets as much as I think? Maybe not, but that doesn't mean he's not going to be on. He's not going to be a big part of the team.
No doubt. But let's dive into a little bit more of a sleeper pick here, Nick. And that's the 2019, this draft class, undrafted rookie free agent Mark McLaurin. And if not for that 4.77 40-yard dash he unfortunately ran, he gets drafted. I think it's a lock because what jumped off the page to me was, the game where he had 3 interceptions against Lamar Jackson in the bowl game in 2017. He's a guy who made an impact on defense for Mississippi State. But here's my question for you. Where do you see him? What do you see from him, and kind of where does he fit bucket-wise into what Bettcher wants to do?
So McLaurin's an interesting dude just because he's a bigger player, right? He's 6'1", like 210. And he has, like Dan said, the foot speed really wasn't there. And I think the other part that has to be explained for context is the Mississippi State defense, which he was playing for, I forget the coordinator in 17, where he played almost exclusively in a 2-high role, particularly to the weak side. So he's playing a boundary safety role most of the time. Compared it to Shoop last year, coming in his first year as defensive coordinator under Moorhead, and basically the defense there was way more multiple. Now he took the bulk of his snaps from a deep safety, a 2-high deep safety role most of the time on the boundary, but he mixed in a lot more down into the basically as a weak side kind of hybrid. Basically the back safety, the boundary safety moving down and the fronts changing and yada yada, things moving around more. The bottom line is his responsibilities range. We're talking about a guy that was responsible for the quarterback and pitch and a lot of blitzes when they were running against the backside of zone read, to a weak side safety as a hook buzzer, all different types of stuff. And man, what surprised me the most, and why I got the most excited about him, was that he actually improved movement skill-wise, I think, from junior to senior year. You kind of rarely see that. His junior year, he was very stiff in his upper body, and he kind of ran a certain way where I didn't like his back pedal. Again, he was a little bit off balance. His ability to change direction wasn't really there. The coaching in 18 was clearly different because he looked different. And when you see a player be able to respond in a positive way, it doesn't mean, the coaching was bad one year and good the other. It means that he can actually get better as things around him change. That doesn't happen a lot. Most players get worse when things around them change because it's human nature. It's very difficult to handle that. And so I see a guy that can basically be adaptable. Now, fast forward, does he have really the foot speed to play the boundary safety and the free safety position as much? I don't think so, not just because he's a player that a lot of guys, a lot of scouting jargon loves to say this phrase. He's quicker than fast. He's in short area space. I like his ability and his balance and his ability to come downhill. In a larger area space, I don't like it as much. And I think that if you put him predominantly in a 2-high role coming downfield, I think in the NFL he may see some struggles. So I do see him more, and I think apparently, and Art Stapleton from Ted asked this question of Bettcher, and Bettcher wanted to try him here. He wanted us to see on the passing downs for the money backer role, and then I think to kind of grow from there. So to be honest, I see him more in competition with Tate Davis for that third linebacker position. And I see him as a guy that, the examples to me, he's solid in almost all traits around the line of scrimmage. So when we say solid, we're talking about 4 out of 7 roughly. So that's not, by the way, that's pretty good in terms of an overall, an ability for the guy to transfer to the next level. I would see that as a good thing. But where I think guys were down on him was because his partner was Abrams, who was a freak of an athlete and a freak of a tackler. And the one thing that you got to say about McLaurin is he wasn't super physical at the point of attack. He's not a big thumper. He's not a guy who was laying the pads. I question his body control, his upper body control, when he carries his pads so high often that it's hard for him to get to the right level, and he can kind of get run over a little bit. But I think if you put him in linebacker drills and got him a little bit more in tune to playing with the correct pad level and didn't ask him to play in space, I think he absolutely could play that around the line of scrimmage role, and that's why he dropped off so much. And it's just so funny when you're watching tape and you see guys that are like unbelievable freaks. A lot of times the other guys who are very good, but they just don't have that same level, get lost in the wash. And I really think that was a big part of it. And I don't think I think he actually played a very important role within the Shoop scheme, because he was rarely ever caught out of position, and he was actually yelling at people to get into position more than you saw him on any other player on that team. So he clearly understood what was being asked of him, and he could clearly help others understand what was being asked of them. That is it. I think that's a huge, huge prerequisite for all, because basically everyone we just described, besides Sam Beal, I could really confirm that for on tape, where guys are like, wow, like their ability to get to where they need to be very quickly is very apparent. Now, are their traits and skills as good as some of the other guys, the other freaks in the draft? No, but their ability to process what they see and to do it very, very fast is absolutely there.
Well, that's awesome to hear, because obviously, as we know, that's a really important trait from James Bettcher's defense. We've gone over why, but just, to harp on it just one more time. Again, listen, it's a defense that's expecting these defensive backs to play multiple roles. But something interesting to me about McLaurin that you mentioned, is kind of that potential to play that third linebacker role, because we're not looking at your traditional safety. McLaurin was measured in at 6'1", 212 pounds. He could probably easily get that up to 220, 31, almost 32-inch arms, had a vert jump of 36 inches. And listen, he's a guy who was the MVP of the TaxSlayer Bowl. In addition to intercepting Jackson 3 times, Lamar Jackson, he also had 11 tackles. And in back-to-back season, he's had 79 and 74 tackles, 4.5 for loss during his senior year. And that's, like you said, playing in different defensive systems. So I think he's a big sleeper for this roster, Nick. And on that note, we are going to close out our coverage of the Giants defensive backs. Hopefully this taught you a lot about where this team is headed in that direction. And also, hopefully, if you have any questions, always feel free to hit us up on Twitter. We are there to answer them. But there are a few questions from the fans for this week that we're going to get into. We're going to start with Benji, who has a couple questions. Benji asked, the first one is, it seems like Sam Beal is getting lost in the shuffle. Where would you guys rank him among the other defensive backs?
I think you would throw him at CB3 from the outside guys, and competing for the inside guys, the boundary safety overhang bucket. I would throw him as like a specialty situation, so it would depend on the opponent. And that's how I would think of it. It's not, and that's why, again, Bettcher, you can't always have just one personnel for each team week in and week out. So I think you will see it mixed in that way.
I think that makes sense, Nick. I do think there's a little more room for potential growth if Baker is a kind of guy who he feels comfortable with in those other two buckets, the nickel or the you know what I'm saying there, so then he can kind of roll with a Beal Jenkins outside, or vice versa with Jenkins. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it also makes sense too, because don't forget, I mean, again, I'm not down on Baker. I really like the pick, but if you have 2 games or 1 or 2 games where he gets DPI penalties like 2 and 3 down the field, because he's used to playing more physical, and you have that type of adjustment, you could see more of Beal earlier, maybe. Sure. That type of thing. It just, again, the way we look at this is it's not good, bad. It's players transition to the next level. It takes time to adjust for everybody, for all different types of reasons. And yeah, I would say Beal is a little bit more attuned to that than coming out of the gate than Baker.
No doubt. And then Benji also asked, would you say the Giants are prioritizing players with athleticism and versatility over players that are just really good at one thing?
Yeah, it's a good. Did we create this podcast to answer that question? Literally, yeah. I didn't realize that was the second question. Yeah, I think that's a great way to think of it. Do one of these guys or one of these players, anyone that we just mentioned, are they the best at their position from an athletic perspective? Probably not. And I would definitely say no. The versatility trait and the mental kind of acumen is what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Andre asks, one of the reasons the Giants drafted Daniel Jones was because he was pro-ready, quote unquote. So why are they so insistent on keeping him on the bench? Sentimentality for Eli yet again, or is there actual logic in keeping a 3-year college starter on the bench until week 17?
Yeah, and so this gets into, I would just first say, and I'm not trying to object or say that's wrong or the label was put on the wrong, but I don't really think he was pro-ready. And I can't really say that if I have him developmental as a pocket passer, which right. is that trait for that area for me, his traits show that he's developmental. I think you could take the biggest Daniel Jones fan. I think if they're not going to say, hey, he's the best pocket passer. So I don't think that's pro ready. Now, how you get pro ready, Dan and I kind of talked about this on the Jones podcast. I don't think it's from mental reps. I don't think he needs any more time to understand what's being asked of him. I think it's actually physically going through those reps to help with his footwork, to help with his timing, and to help with his ability to distribute to his second and third read accordingly in an offense that's it's not that it's necessarily more complex. It's just you're asking the guy to do a wider range of things, a wider range of plays on a more consistent basis. Excuse me. So that's where I see it's not necessarily logic in keeping him on the bench. I think it's more. I guess I want to say this without actually believing it, but I think it's because Shurmur thinks that Eli can give him the best chance to win. Why that starter is going to be there? People say that's crazy. That no matter what, Eli's going to be the starter, and I get it because of it's the New York Giants and it's Eli. But I genuinely think that Shurmur thinks that in a week one basis, Eli's going to give you the better chance to win, and he's going to and Jones is going to give you the better chance as a backup.
And listen, these things are not mutually exclusive, guys. I can believe that the smart play for the Giants long term is to bring Daniel Jones in for week one, because the exact reason Nick brought up, which I do agree with, that the more actual reps he gets, the better he'll be for the future. But at the same time, I can actually agree with Shurmur, and I do, that Eli Manning gives them the best chance to win in week one, because, guys, rookies don't just come in and steal the show. I don't know what football you've been watching, but take a look at that highly touted rookie class from 2018, with the exception of Baker Mayfield. None of them moved the ball consistently. Josh Allen had a couple fun runs and a couple fun deep passes, but the guy threw 52%, completed 52% of his passes, and they punted a hell of a lot. Darnold, the same thing. Rosen, the same thing. There is a transition for these quarterbacks to get used to the processing of the NFL speed and the NFL speed of the game. And in week one, I just don't believe that anyone can convince me that Daniel Jones will be better for the offense than Eli Manning. That's just how I feel about rookie quarterbacks. While, again, at the same time, I believe he should be playing week one regardless, because I don't think there's much of a ceiling for the Giants with Eli Manning, so I just don't see the point of Eli Manning. So, again, these things aren't mutually exclusive. There's a lot that goes into them, and I believe it can be debated on different levels. But we'll move on to Big Blue Bobby, who asks, hey, guys, I love the podcast and the tweets. Is there a reason why you didn't talk about what we see as Dexter Lawrence's potential with Justin Reid? He honestly didn't sound like he went that in-depth dip in production.
And I think that this gets into tape study a little bit and how guys see players. I think you can kind of get different judgments and different takes and kind of agree that the same traits are there, but that you think that at the next level as they transition, which is the whole goal of what you're looking to do when you project, Jordan didn't see the traits coming that I saw in terms of pass rushing. And maybe it's because he didn't see those snaps in those games, because guys like me that are bulled up on Lawrence have to show you the tape, and we have. But those examples don't happen on the majority of snaps. The majority of snaps that you're seeing when he's in the 4-eye rushing, he's in a bull rush, and yeah, he gains ground. But in terms of actual production, you don't see that actual production like Dan hinted, or what was hinted is that he was injured as well, so you don't see that same type of production. And I think that what happens is how a player has to change, and how it's kind of a moving stick as you evaluate a human who's going to change. And he's 340 pounds. He said publicly he wants to cut that weight.
Right.
Well, I like that. And I see that his projected traits are going to get better with less weight. And so there's things like that where I think that's where the difference in the evaluation comes. It's not saying that, hey, you'll rarely find two guys that have watched tape that do it professionally that go, I see this trait, and the other guy goes, no, that trait's not there at all. They both see the traits, but the varying degree at which they see them, and then how they see them transitioning in the future to either a different playing field or to a different team. That's where the difference comes in. And so, yeah, we didn't kind of press on that or kind of ask him more on that, because he saw him as an interior 2-gap run stuffer, which is what I think that's basically his floor. And that's what excites me, is that I will totally agree that, yeah, that's what you got. But the upside, specifically for what the Giants need in stunts, which it was so funny watching the Giants the last 2 days. I've really gotten in depth with the DBs, and you keep on watching these 4-man rushes with the stunts, and they're just so ineffective. And the drivers and the stunts are just not gaining ground. It's like, yeah, that's what he's really good at. And so I think that dynamic within the Giants system is going to really help. And it's something that, yeah, unless you're really in tune to that as a Giant need, you may not see that as a trait needed.
And listen, if you want to talk to me about specific Giants needs, Nick, I'm going to tell you that being a driver in the stunt is, as a player who can be a driver in the stunt game is one of their biggest needs. And you harped on this, Nick, so we don't need to go too much further. But I do want to mention one more thing, Bobby. if you give up on the idea that sacks are everything for a defensive lineman's production standpoint from a pass rush standpoint, and you look at the pass rush productivity percentage, and that's something that Pro Football Focus does, and that it just combines their hurries, their sacks, and their hits. And again, even Nick said it best with the simulated pressures. Even you can't really get a full grasp of pass rush because those aren't always considered a hurry, but they do a decent job tracking them. And he's right up there with some of the interior linemen from the 2019 class. Is the best pass rush productivity grade. So, if you kind of get away from the sacks or everything, you start to see that he really wasn't that unproductive, even while playing through an injury and during those seasons. And again, when you add in what Nick said about him playing at a different weight, there's a lot of upside, and in addition to the floor. We got one more question for today, and it's from Zach Mahoney, who asks, can I convince you to go into detail with Pat Shurmur's offense? I noticed last year there was a lack of deep balls thrown. Is that more of Pat Shurmur's playbook, or was it because he understood the limitation of his offensive line's lack of production past 2.5 seconds? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. Within what Pat and many coaches do, and it's not really rocket science. The bulk of what Shurmur would call would be flood concepts. So the flood concept being one deep player to one side of the field, to the same side, a medium level player, and to the same side, a lower level, a flat player, basically a short route, and just mixing and matching and doing a lot of dressing up those types of concepts the most, and basically going there. So you're looking in a concept that, at least for that half of the field, that is going to have one vertical guy. And yeah, did you have that one vertical guy being thrown to often? No. And so I think it's a function of the fact that the bulk of Pat Shurmur's success is in the intermediate range,
right?
Which you're talking about 12 to 18 yards downfield. Now, the only thing that gets a little funky about this that I think fans don't really realize until they spend too much of their life watching tape, if you have a 3-step drop from shotgun and you throw a rhythm fade, so you hit the top of your drop and you're sending the ball right away, is that a deep shot, or is that a rhythm read in the first read? That ball is going to hit at 22 to 24 yards downfield. So that's technically a deep ball, but if you watch that, if I show you those clips, you go, that looks like almost like an intermediate route to me. So the disconnect I would say sometimes is that Shurmur's concepts aren't sending two guys often deep down the field as both eligible receivers and guys that are probably going to get the ball within the read. You just don't see that as much, and it's to the questioner's point about, hey, there's not a lot of time, and quite frankly, you don't have a quarterback that wants to do that.
Right. I think that's a big point that kind of goes lost in this.
Correct, and it does get lost, but let's be honest, it's not. Guys like me say it's really not that big of a deal in today's NFL, where the bulk of throws are between 3 and 11 yards. And I just said, and we just kind of said that intermediate routes can be pushed down the field to 18 to 20 yards. I do think, though, like we've talked about the wide receiver groups, you need guys that are vertical threats. And this is answering the question, the third part of it. They didn't have a genuine guy that I think could generate separation all the time. I think OBJ did it when OBJ is given a break in his route. I think he's like the best in the league. When he was running straight fades or even corner routes, I was underwhelmed by his play last year. Doesn't mean I think he's bad. I just think that he didn't have as good a year as he has had.
You don't call OBJ the greatest thing God wide receivers. God forbid. I'm glad you didn't say this on Twitter, Nick.
Right. No, right. It's one of those things. Like, I don't think he's a bad player. I just don't think he played as well as he did in that area of the field as he has at other seasons. If you give him a break, he was awesome. He was really, really good. And so I think, the straight fade ball or to like the deep double post balls, yeah, they didn't have guys that, or they didn't have a play style that really threw that, but not much of the league is going that way. But I think it's something where with one vertical threat, one bona fide vertical threat, I think it could help the intermediate routes the most. So I hope that answers the question from 3 different angles.
Yeah, I mean, it's an in-depth question, so hopefully we got you there. If not, feel free to follow up with us on Twitter. But on that note, guys, we are going to be signing off on today's show. Please, again, if you guys do enjoy the show, we really do appreciate you guys helping us grow the show, and the best way to do that is by downloading every episode. That's the key metric. But also rating us and subscribing to our podcast, and then just telling more Giants fans who you think would enjoy this about the show. We will be back at some point soon. Obviously, I'm taking my first and much-needed vacation starting on Monday, and it will be about a 10-day vacation where I will be in the mountains. I'm going to Glacier National Park and Banff National Park, so I'll be out of service, as they say. And so me and Nick will probably be taking a little bit of a break, but we will be back and we'll be hitting it hard. And we can't wait to get that preseason game film rolling so we can really do what we enjoy the most about this podcast and what really gave us the idea for the podcast. So on that note, guys, thanks again for tuning in, and we will talk to you soon. And as you guys know, as I do like to end this thing, go Giants.